to introduce Lord David Puttnam, who will be known to many as the award-winning filmmaker and producer of films including Chariots of Fire and Bugsy Malone, which played a big part in my own childhood, and The Mission, among others, as well as for his participation in his seat on the Labour bench in the House of Lords. And in 2019, he was appointed to chair the Select Committee on Democracy and Digital Technologies, which published a report titled Digital Technology and the Resurrection of Trust in 2020, the perfect year for such a thing. Before we start, we agreed that we wanted to issue a prompt or perhaps challenge to anyone in the audience who works for a tech company. If they want to contradict what we're talking about, they're very welcome to do so, and just raise a hand. If they don't work for a tech company, can they still? Will we take them seriously?
We will.
Yeah. Okay, let's kick it off then. I mean, the first thing I'm interested in asking you about is that it sounds like this report was a long time in the works. What first interested or alarmed you about this issue?
Well, I had a piece of luck, Roisin, which was that prior to this report, I'd served on the House of Lords AI committee, looking at the implications of AI in society generally, and that was a real wake up. I mean, it was we took evidence. The great thing about the House of Lords committees is you're allowed to take evidence from anybody and anywhere, including, of course, on video. So we had some pretty, as we were saying this morning, pretty impressive people who turned up to give evidence. So I learned a lot on this AI committee about what the ramifications of this were, including I began to understand these black boxes, the black boxes that control the algorithms, and the resistance of the social media companies in particular to have anyone look in their black boxes or even university research into the way in which these algorithms can be tweaked or altered or amended. And the truth, as I came to understand it during that committee, was that nearly all the changes and tweaks that were basically made to increase the profitability of their advertising offering. So what you had was a business model which was, in a sense, I would say perverted, but some would say converted, to optimize advertising revenues, irrespective of the value of the information they were providing or the validity of the information they were providing. So I slightly came to it with a certain skepticism. And then, out of the blue, I was asked to chair this committee on the relationship between digital technology and democracy, which certainly interested me a lot. Worth just saying, that was in a sense off the back of work I'd done 20 years earlier when I chaired the committee that set up our communications regulator. So I had 3 bits of input, if you like, into what was actually a very interesting 15-month exercise.
What's the timeline of that? That's going back decades, right?
Yeah, I mean, it started for me in 2000. But I was originally appointed to work on the Ofcom regulatory framework in 2000. So, 20 years.
And then did you see things going the way that they have done now? Were you pessimistic or optimistic?
Well, there were 2 extraordinary things. One was, in 2000, we were actually, part of our mandate was not to even mention digital. This was a communications regulator dealing in television and the physical world. And it was felt by the then Blair government that digital was a kind of Wild West and unregulatable, quite genuinely. So part of our remit was not to get into digital. So that was in itself fascinating. We can touch on that if you like later. So I kept tracking it. Also important to say that what was difficult was, whilst I was a Labour member of the Labour Party, I got slightly head-to-head with the government of the day because I had been a critic for at least 15 years prior to that of one person, and that was Rupert Murdoch, who I believed was doing unbelievable damage to... My dad was a journalist, and I had a kind of, if you like, slightly idealistic view of journalism. And my feeling was that this man, this Australian, was trashing it. There are others, incidentally, who feel that he helped save newspapers. There is an argument. But so I was in opposition to him. And unfortunately, what happened was, in putting together the regulation creating the regulator, the legislation creating the regulator, I came head-to-head with Murdoch and Murdoch's people. And they had the ear of the government at the end of the day, for reasons that's what happens in politics. And so I found myself with a lot of issues with Number 10. And what emerged from that, I think this is interesting, was some compromises. And one of the compromises was to get them to agree that the regulator had a duty of care to citizens. Now, that was a problem because the word citizen had never occurred in British legislation, because in Britain, we're not citizens, we're subjects of the Crown. So there was a real issue about what a citizen was. And what emerged out of that was, and the compromise, was the idea of a public interest test. That when you were making judgments as a regulator, you had to take account of the public interest. I'm probably making this way too complicated, but of the public interest as opposed to the corporate interest.
No.
And these were really fundamental things that we thought we'd won, done, and dusted. And then, of course, to an extent, got undermined by the digital world.
And now the real battle starts.
And then the real battle started.
I found the kind of questions raised in the report around media so compelling and fascinating. And it's interesting you say your father was a journalist. My father worked as a journalist, and my mother did too. And I grew up in a climate where journalism was a reliable job and where there were ideals still, and probably they were already in the act of, declining from a previous era. But then I participated in the thing that, in my eyes now, killed media as it was, which is the internet and social media. And now we have obviously these tech giants who refuse to call themselves media companies, but which are the most powerful media companies in the world, and probably in history. I don't know. But so you talk about fact-checking in the report. How do you envision that playing out for the best? And is it possible to, not to be dramatic here, but is it possible to redeem the media from depending upon social media to the degree it does now?
I think so. I mean, the word that kind of jumps out all the time, and you've used it several times this afternoon earlier, is trust. Originally, when I did the first draft of the report, I called it the restoration of trust. Digital media and the restoration of trust. What emerged from the evidence was the situation was much, much more serious than restoration. And this is why I switched the title to resurrection. It struck me that trust had all but died. And there's nothing that's happened in the last 12 months that's convinced me otherwise. And that what was needed was a kind of resurrection moment. It is possible. And of course, this is where, as I say, if there is anyone here who wants to just say that these are assertions, it's fine. I'm very happy to argue my case. But these black boxes, and this goes right back to the very first thing I said, doing the AI committee, these black boxes are manageable. This is not a force of nature. You make decisions about what's in them, and good university research can look into those and change them. If you, and I think you may well, are a sufficiently prolific source of information that you get 5,000 followers, you're a person of interest to the social media companies, because you're generating revenues and you're generating advertising revenue. So at 5,000, you get a green tick. Now, our argument is it isn't an issue of freedom of speech against non-freedom of speech. It's about, and again, you used the word earlier, and absolutely right, it's about amplification and the quality of information that gets amplified. So our argument in the report was at 5,000, well, that's freedom of speech, but at 5,000, you need to be able to validate what you're saying, or find some means of ensuring to the viewer that it's a personal view, not a fact. So we're looking for that trigger, 5,000 arbitrary number. That's the figure they use. And the truth is that they can do it. And this is what drives me nuts. It isn't that they can't do it. It's the fact they've got a business model to which it's extremely inconvenient, because it would mean a reduction of advertising revenue. That would mean a reduction of their share price, which would mean that people had nothing to do with the creation of Google or Facebook or anybody else. The shareholders would start having a view on what was trustworthy and what wasn't. So that's the circularity of my position.
Yeah, it's so fascinating because it cuts to the core of ultimately what is social media for. And I think over the last 10 years, that's gone from being these extremely idealistic messages around a democratized media, around everyone having a voice, almost techno-utopian ideas of mass consensus being reached, as though that was ever reached before. Why would it occur on Twitter? But, now it's so clear that amplification needs extremes of opinion and behavior and feelings, and it needs discord, actually, up to a point. So the most extreme opinions will probably do the best. And in that sense, Donald Trump was the ideal Twitter user, but also he was the one that they fact-checked because he was so visible.
Yeah.
Would they be prepared to accept this?
I think this is where regulation comes in. I think they have to be compelled to accept it. I don't think it's a question of whether they're prepared to. And unfortunately, because of the revenues they generate, what you've got is certainly countries in the Western democracies sort of attempting to play footsie with them. It's like, I wonder if you'd be good enough to help us with creating trust. Therefore, if we create trust, we might have a better shot at sustaining democracy, because we can't sustain trust. We ain't going to be able to sustain democracy. That's certain. And I don't know how far you go in that conversation. There's a moment where you say, thank you very much indeed, you're really useful. We want you to succeed, but these are the conditions under which you're going to be allowed to succeed. We did it with broadcasting. We've done it with all sorts of media. The mistake was made, and it wasn't deliberate, was Clinton, 1992, I think it was called Section 230. Clinton created a situation where the social media companies would not be considered as publishers. It was balmy then, it's triple balmy now.
Yeah.
And that's actually what let the whole the cat out of the bag. From that point on, we've had a problem.
This leads on to something where you argued for responsibility, not corporate responsibility, but personal responsibility. And it's so striking and actually a really refreshing thing to hear someone say that, because I think we're used to thinking of technology with a kind of mysticism almost, the same way that people talk about the free market. And even though we have these very visible faces of tech corporations, we have, the Mark Zuckerbergs and the Jeff Bezos of this world, and the galaxy now. He's left the planet. But we're not used to actually thinking of people being to blame. How would you envision this playing out? Are we going to have a public trial of Mark Zuckerberg?
I sincerely hope not. I'm not sure it would change the expression on his face in any way either.
No, he wouldn't be perturbed.
They wouldn't notice.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, I was brought up in the world where it was a crime. If you cried fire in the cinema, that was being deeply irresponsible, and that was an abrogation of personal responsibility. In a sense, by handing a megaphone to people like Zuckerberg, you are creating a huge amount of personal responsibility for him. I thought the great question in the congressional hearing, there was only one good one, was I don't even know what he was at, the senator who said to him, Mr. Zuckerberg, where did you stay last night? And Zuckerberg looked like a hair caught in the headlights and said, well, why would you ask? He said, I'm asking because you want to know where everyone else in New York stayed, so I think it's not unreasonable for us to know where you stayed. And it was a fabulous moment. It was fabulous. It was a one time where we actually got to the core of the truth of what they're all about.
Yeah. Yeah, and it didn't have to be this way. And we accept it like it just because it is our daily life, that it's normal. I think something really interesting is going on in culture right now. You have films like The Social Dilemma, and it's after Edward Snowden, and it's after other whistleblowers too. But I think we're still in that mindset where we don't entirely question it. We don't question it enough maybe to take action. Although I do know people are falling away from Facebook. They're content to keep using WhatsApp though, right?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, the irony is, if you want to be generous about this, that Mark Zuckerberg and the creators, the founders of Google, are caught in the horns of a terrible dilemma. That if they do the right thing, their share price will drop. And the share price drops, their investors will be really pissed off. So what do? They'd probably rather have, in truth, they'd rather have a government regulate them and say, this is what you've got to do. Because then, in a sense, they don't have to go to the next annual general meeting and explain.
Yeah.
So in an odd way, it may let them off the hook. Because, he may have to survive on 2 billion instead of 20 billion. I mean, he'll get by.
Might not go to space, though.
No, he may not.
Sad. I thought something which emerges from reading the report is, I was struck by how you got them to talk on record. You got representatives from big tech, including Vint Cerf, who is billed as the evangelist of Google and a kind of father of the internet as well. And he doesn't come out of it looking very good. One of the lines that really stuck in memory was him saying, competition will take care of everything. We have competitors. Do you? Does Ask Jeeves still exist?
Absolutely.
AOL? No, you don't. But, if they were to be left with responsibility, say like Facebook brought in that board to regulate itself, so Facebook is telling Facebook how to run Facebook, can they be trusted? Is there any reality where we could put enough pressure on them to take care of things themselves?
Only governments can. I think the EU, through Mrs. Vestager, are really on them. The problem there is creating a coherent digital policy across the EU, but I think the EU are onto this. I'd love to think the UK might. UK's got this new bill, which was originally the Online Harms Bill, which they've renamed the Online Safety Bill, which I think is more comfortable probably for the social media companies. And that's got some real strength in it. It certainly attempts to protect children. They're dealing in the backlash of a case, and this is what's going to be interesting. A lot of this stuff's going to end up in the courts, for sure. The Molly Russell case was a very interesting case where a young girl committed suicide, having posted a lot of posts about self-harm and everything else. And the issue is whether the social media companies had the responsibility of taking down those posts or other ways of trying to ensure it didn't happen. So the Molly Russell case has become a very big case. Not so much arguments, because we're in a persuasion mode at the moment with the government is, don't create legislation which necessarily has to end up at judicial review in the courts in order to be clarified. There are certainly one or two politicians here I think would agree with me. The worst thing you can do is create legislation that you either can't enforce or that requires clarification in the courts. That's bad, tends to be bad legislation. But that is the inevitable road we're going down, because they're creating legislation which offers so many questions, it's got so many variables attached to it.
Yeah. Speaking as an outsider with no real understanding of even legal language, I've been paying attention to Max Schrems for the last few years. And I could be wrong here, but what strikes me about that is he's proving that with enough money and power, anyone can get around the law. And with data, anyone can do whatever they want with it as long as they have enough lawyers. It just depends on, can you afford to interpret the law to your own ends?
I spent a dozen very happy years as president of UNICEF in the UK. And that took Patsy and I all around the world looking at things. And the one thing I came back with, obviously you see and deal in awful, awful, awful situations, that the one thing you come back with is the absolute fundamental importance of the rule of law. Countries that have a rule of law have a chance. Countries which begin to demolish or dismantle the rule of law have no chance. And this is why I'm really passionate about clear law, enforceable law, enforced laws, good laws, and everyone understanding them. And the problem is this digital world we're going into is kind of lawless, and it's partly our fault and partly their fault. There's been a huge reluctance to actually clarify things that we know in our souls, our hearts, are wrong. You don't have to be an evangelical to understand that there's a lot of harm being done at the same time as a lot of value is being created by the digital world. That's, as a human being, your instincts tell you that.
Yeah.
It's the reluctance of governments to say, you know what, enough's enough. We love the idea that you can be very positive and helpful, but we're just not going to let you do this because you're undermining us. You are creating mistrust in law. And what's fascinating was 77,000 words in the report. The government didn't take it all that seriously. It was published the 29th of June last year. The government didn't take it all that seriously until the 6th of January. And all of a sudden, all that stuff we've been saying about the threat to democracy and misinformation, disinformation, all came home to roost. So I'm not being complacent, and I don't feel remotely complacent. I just think that there are now massive questions we've got to answer. You and I touched on it when we were chatting earlier. Right now, what's the story every day? Afghanistan. What's happening in Afghanistan? What's happening in Afghanistan is being reported particularly on the BBC. The BBC, and I absolutely believe this, 60% of all Afghans get their news from the BBC in 3 different languages. On the other hand, what's happening about the UK is the government are salami slicing the BBC for revenues. So the first thing that has to go are these, as it were, fringe offerings that the BBC World Service does. And yet at the moment, it's the only way we're getting reliable information, in a sense, out of Afghanistan. Because God forbid, BBC closes down, we start relying on Facebook for what's happening.
Yeah.
How ludicrous would that be?
And the media has kind of allowed that to become the norm for a long time. I say as someone from the media, but it's no replacement. And yeah, something I wanted to ask about as well was in my day-to-day work actually as a journalist, I encounter this phrase a lot, or this kind of this thing that's being repeated, and who's to know if it's really true or not, but that in the last year, as a result of the pandemic, there's been 10 years worth of digitization. And you've been invested in this cause for 2 decades, and that's multiple generations who are missing potentially the right level of literacy, education, and maybe their rights. And I think that exponential rate of change, not to kind of buy into the hype of the tech industry, but it's true. It is rapidly changing. It's not always becoming more sophisticated, but it is just growing and taking in more aspects of daily life. And it strikes me that government is hopelessly behind. How is it possible to catch up?
There's two really interesting questions tucked into there. When we were taking evidence, and I said we took evidence from all over the world, the most compelling for me came from Estonia and Finland. Why? Really, really simple. Because for Estonia and Finland, particularly Estonia, with a 20% Russian population, these are existential issues. They cannot afford misinformation. They can't afford disinformation because the whole of society could fall apart. So they are really hot on digital literacy, on ensuring that a fact-based society and getting facts out. The Finns as well are very good in this area. Until we in Western Europe understand that these are existential issues, we're not going to crack them. But they are, and we should be beginning to come to terms with the fact they are. So as it were, the example, Britain in particular is terrible at looking at good examples from other countries, always thinks it knows best. But the really interesting examples came from these small countries where the threat was enormous. Taiwan is another. Yeah. Absolutely understands. It's on the edge of a precipice. It can't afford misinformation and disinformation.
So necessity drives them to educate and...
Absolutely.
Yeah, and to embrace it.
And Roisin, we had this in legislation in 2003. Nothing got done. The Department of Education in the UK in 2003 was through Ofcom was mandated to deliver digital literacy. 20 years later, that's about 4 digital generations, actually.
Yeah.
20 years.
There are probably micro-generations contained within those generations as well. And they have their own entirely different memes. I found something kind of odd about... So I encountered the phrase real-world harm a lot. From detractors, from skeptics, people telling me I'm being alarmist. I know people who are much more worried about surveillance and surveillance capitalism than I am, but I've been told in the past that I'm a little bit too worried too. And where is the real world harm? And I feel like it is all around us. It is hard, I suppose, to pinpoint one reason. Like, you can't just say online misinformation led people to storm the Capitol in America, for instance. But to me, that is the real world harm. Have you encountered the same thing?
Yes, I mean, without question. As I said, and that's what's interesting, from the guy sitting in Nancy Pelosi's chair with horns on to Molly Russell's suicide, those are real world harms. And that's the spectrum. It is the spectrum. The individual child cutting themselves, posting the fact they're doing it, and no one actually able to, as it were, address that or that issue. And the individual, to, as I say, to the guy with horns in Nancy Pelosi. That's the spectrum. And that's the complexity of this. We're trying with the online safety bill to address some of this. But there's 3 major flaws, and they're worth touching on in the legislation. Number one, for whatever reason, the government wished this to be the individual to, as it were, to attack legally the social media company, not groups. Well, that's, for me, utterly fallacious. Because if, for example, the individual is Jewish, who believes that there's an anti-Semitic issue going on, what will happen immediately is effectively like in America, a class action suit will be created, and the individual, me, whoever it might be, we're the name on the legal docket, but in fact you're taking on an entire group. So to pretend otherwise, I think is fatuous, and I think that's one, for example, that we will win in the House of Lords. That's one. You mentioned personal responsibility. That's a huge issue. At the moment, basically what they're saying is going to be fines, corporate fines. Well, first of all, corporations insure themselves against fines. Yeah. I've sat on a number of boards. The only time a board really sits up and takes notice is when someone says, of course, we've got personal liability. Oh, really? So you've got to find a way of creating a personal liability for the individuals who make the decisions not to have corrected the algorithm that caused the harm. That's a person. That's a human being. Mm-hmm. It's not a corporation, it's a person. So that would be another one. And the third one, as we touched on, is the amplification issue. That you don't allow yourself to get confused between freedom of speech and the amplification of lies, because within there is the damage.
it's a really difficult thing to get a grasp on. A lot of my understanding of it comes from a podcast that came out a year or so ago called Rabbit Hole, about how someone can become radicalized just by watching YouTube videos. And in the report, there's a line, I took note of who had said it, the Oxford Internet Institute. I think they're unnamed, the person who actually said it, in case of personal responsibility. But they say that very few people actually find themselves in echo chambers or filter bubbles. And I found that really jarring, because I remember reading the book of The Filter Bubble years ago and thinking, this is probably the most convincing argument against, or at least for skepticism of online life that I've ever read, actually. I'd love to know your opinion on it, because I know you were kind of in the interest of including everyone's opinion that you interviewed in the report. But to me, filter bubbles are real, and they're responsible for a lot of things. And I just remember my feelings when Brexit came through. I would never have expected that to happen. And then I look back and I think I was in a filter bubble.
Yes, I think we're all somewhat guilty of that. I think, first of all, the Oxford Internet Institute are fantastic. They are world-class and world-leading researchers. And it's the degree to which they're not being allowed inside these black boxes that is one of the things that we actually specifically talk about in the report. Why on earth wouldn't you want the world's most sophisticated research institute to look at your black boxes and advise you on ways in which you can improve your algorithmic recommendations? So that would be one. But I think we do live in our filter bubbles. I'm sometimes guilty of that. I'm a Guardian reader and I don't read the Telegraph, which gives me tends to give me a slant on life.
Would you want to read the Telegraph?
No, my best friend used to read the Telegraph, and it was a cause of unbelievable pain. He was also an Arsenal supporter, which made it worse. And that was his filter, incidentally.
It's funny that there's a book that we talked about. Well, we talked about the author of that book, Tim Wu, who, he's written this book that I'm a fan of, The Attention Merchants. And it's a history of attention from the origins of the media up until the social media age. And I don't know, something that emerges from that book is that media was always reliant on the reader's bias. So, the Telegraph reader probably wasn't buying The Guardian, and the Guardian reader wasn't buying the Telegraph. In one sense, that's just kind of a perennial feature of how media works. And even some of the examples he gives in that book are the oldest kind of publicly accessible newspapers that weren't specifically like journals that cost a lot, that a lot of people couldn't afford. But they told complete lies. They had a series of articles about how there was a man living on the moon. That's one of his examples. So is it that the internet is bringing these biases into a kind of more dangerous new era, and also ironically, where it was supposed to champion truth? Or is this just always going to keep coming back, is my question.
This is the paradox. And the president, I don't want to embarrass him, used a word the other day that I love, was the agora, the public space, the place where debate takes place. That's what the internet was supposed to be. That's what Tim Berners-Lee believed the internet was going to be. It is, in a sense, and maybe too strong a word, it's the perversion of the role of the internet to create a global agora that is the tragedy. And it is a tragedy, actually. It's a tragedy. And we're all partly to blame. It's not just Mark Zuckerberg's fault. We all, in a sense, were complicit in looking at this thing which had such extraordinary degree of promise and then allowing it to become an advertising medium. That was a mistake.
And you talk in the report about democracy and even about the possibility of digital voting. And then also another kind of paradox being that obviously when you're on the internet, you're participating in something owned by a tiny, tiny fraction. Or I think I remember in the report the phrase, a very small group of gatekeepers. And, we've just gone through the pandemic and watched Jeff Bezos. I suspect my head would just explode were I to fully understand the extent of his wealth. But, he went to space, he got off the spacecraft and thanked everyone who shops with Amazon. As a writer, I shouldn't admit that I am among those people. But so that's a paradox there. They've been selling us on this idea of a democratized internet for so long now, that everything is more convenient and accessible and you can have a voice. Do you think people are waking up to this?
I think they will wake up. I've now used it 3 times, and I used it a 4th time. It all boils down to public trust. Unless we can recreate public trust, and unless you can create personal responsibility to sustain public trust, then democracy isn't just endangered. I think democracy is on the slide path to nowhere. And I don't see hope. Unless we trust each other, we're not going to solve climate change. I don't know. In fact, we could sit here all evening and try and think of something which we might actually solve without trust. Personal relationships, corporate relationships, they're all absolutely founded on trust. And somehow trust has become a commodity, and you can't commoditize trust.
Yes, something that fascinates me, and it's almost as rooted in science fiction as it is in everyday life, is that on some level we're all a little bit in mourning for the real world when we immerse ourselves in the internet. Like, we're in mourning for even the relationship we all have to our own bodies and to space and time. There's a lovely book that came out a year or two ago called How to Do Nothing that explores this. And she argues that we should probably learn the name of trees in our immediate area. We should spend time to get to know the sounds of different birds and their names, which sounds so sentimental, but it's real. I mean, we forget this. But in the report, you talk about community. And even, I found it interesting relatively early on in it, you kind of say communities, even things like trade unions or even churches, attendance is declining in all of this. And I think that has an effect. Do you think we're going through a sort of, the phrase that gets used is like future shock, isn't it? But of being almost disembodied and disconnected from the world we live in.
I think it's a very real danger. And I hope this doesn't sound sentimental, but it's factual. So by far the most significant role I have in life is Vice President of the Skibbereen Rowing Club. It gives me more pleasure than almost anything. Thank you very much. It's a cheap applause line, but it's true. And they train at the bottom of our garden. And there's a point in our garden that's used as a start and finishing line. And Patsy and I were able to wake up most mornings and certainly all evenings and watch these kids, and our kids especially, training. They're certainly in our term kids. The sheer physical effort, pleasure, honesty of it is fantastic. And what I'm always banging on about locally is that a rowing club, very important because there's no point in someone not turning up. You're screwed. They all have an obligation, personal obligation to each other, to all turn up, all train, all get into a rhythm and try and succeed. And that's why I think that the boys, the Olympic medals, are far more than just medals. They are a triumph for us in Skib of community and of commitment and of kind of honesty. And for that, I don't put a date on that. To me, I could be looking at something that's been done 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. There's something beautiful about watching these guys, men and women, rowing and succeeding in an Olympian sense. So I don't know if that's a romanticized view of what you're saying, but because I'm aware of that and because of where we live, and which is completely wonderful, I do think that there's a yearning. That's my touch point now.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh, completely. Yeah. You're getting a round of applause. Yeah. No, I think I view it the same way. I mean, yoga is my version of that, basically, trying to resist the internet. And I think also this leads on to another thing. I mean, this is a very vague question, but I think we all inhabit a sort of state of permanent futility when we use social media. And even when we talk about big tech, because it's like even the very nature of this phrase, black box, it preserves its own mystery. It resists interpretation. It's not for you. It's for some guy in a hoodie in a room somewhere, like in a boardroom. And if you even go on social media these days, I feel like the mood is one predominantly of frustration and futility. There's very little joy to be found there. The joy is off the screen. And I wonder if that comes from knowing just how powerful these things are and how we are just what feeds it.
There's a story, I know this to be true. Gordon Brown had lunch with, and the only other person who was in lunch was a friend of mine, with the guys from Google. This was quite early on. And Brown started talking about legislation. And what came back, it was Eric Schmidt. What came back was, no, you don't understand. We are now larger than any individual country. We'll tell you what we'll do. And Gordon was so gobsmacked that literally was lost lost for words.
Wow.
Now, I got that from the other person in the room, so I know that to be the case. And I think that Schmidt probably absolutely believed that he was sitting with a guy who was he was the Prime Minister at the time, Prime Minister of the UK. UK wasn't big enough to stop them. And I think the social media businesses do believe themselves to be supranational, as the oil companies did for a great number of years.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I mean, GDPR is interesting in that context, in that it kind of localizes to a degree. I mean, it's about Europe, but I mean, I'm interested in that. Do you think it's possible to localize the internet?
It's a really great question. I'm not. I wish I could answer it. I would like to think so, but I'm not. I'm not sure. I'm not sure in whose interest it would end up being. And of course, there is a real problem. We've talked, for example, about Hungary. You could end up, by localizing it, increase the potential of demagoguery.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So that's tricky.
Firewalls, censorship.
I'd need a day or two to think about that.
That's actually another big quandary I wanted to ask you about, is the issue of anonymity.
Yeah.
Which I told you earlier, I don't have an answer for. If were it to be somehow enforced that you couldn't be anonymous on the internet, and I was saying that I think that would be the ultimate admission of the failure of the great project, in that we'd just be calling it quits, basically. The techno-utopian dream is over and everyone has to show their passport and their COVID compliance cert to get online. But I don't know, do you have a conclusion on this or not?
If only. I admitted to Roisin earlier that there was a fudge, and there's a fudge in the report. The fudge in the report was I was really, really determined to try and make it a unanimous report, because it's an all-party group and we were doing really, really well. But it was absolutely evident quite early on I was not going to get agreement across the group on the issue of anonymity, because there are two very, very good arguments. One is that it would quell the opportunities for whistleblowers. It would be a chilling effect on whistleblowers. And the other is it right to be able to scream through a megaphone insults that are completely unsubstantiated about an individual and remain anonymous? So it's a very, very tricky one. And I did fudge it. I mean, there was some wording in there. I don't know if I'm sure you saw through it immediately. I came up with some wording that just about got by both groups, but it's bullshit. And I know that we didn't solve the problem, and I still don't really know what the answer is.
This reminds me of, weirdly, a few years ago, I went to Wikimania, which is the annual gathering of Wikipedia. And someone got up and gave a speech about Wikipedia as a model of consensus on the internet, and that this could then be applied to for kind of democratic means. And all I could think was the back end of every Wikipedia page is just a debate. Do you see, is that a model, or is there some other template that could be reached where you can call, and at what point after the debate has been going on a while do you call something consensus?
I think Wikipedia is, first of all, it's remarkable, but God knows I use it a lot. And it was a great concept. My only argument with Wikipedia is, having been the victim of this to a degree, is that when there is a factual error in it, and you know it's a factual error, it's extremely difficult to get them to correct the factual error. You always have to get to a third-party corrective. It's kind of very complicated. So I think that the one improvement, and it may be lack of money, is the truth, the one improvement they could make is the fact-checking system could be improved. But otherwise, it's an invaluable asset. And one of the great things that did emerge from the internet, without any doubt at all. Yeah,
they're sort of preserving a dream, aren't they, that isn't really alive anywhere else online.
Yep, it's the closest we've got.
Yeah, it is. And it's a little bit messy, and the design isn't beautiful, but it does its job.
It does its job.
In the report, you mentioned the van der Leyen administration, is that the term? But I was just thinking recently that they're the ones who brought about the rules on ethical AI, weren't they? The directives. If anyone doesn't know about this, it's interesting. It's a directive bringing in, I mean, you might know it in better detail, but basically it's regulating the use of AI. And one of the uses that stood out to me was in recruitment, for instance, because AI is very discriminating, not in a good way. I mean, AI is racist, for one thing, often. Not all AI, I suppose, but some of it. What's your take on AI, and can it be even fully regulated? I think this is a good start.
I think there's a huge battle going on amongst some very good people in study for the soul of AI. And I think that some of the most advanced people are on the side of the angels. I've no doubt about that. I mean, Google got a jump start on most people by bringing in very, very serious expertise. But again, it comes back to this business of the monetization of it. If you create a monetization structure that is neutral and which preserves the very best of AI, for example, in medicine, for example, that's good. If, on the other hand, you distort AI so that actually it becomes a means of, again, I'm using advertising but rather loosely, a means of just accruing or increasing advertising volume and advertising revenues, then necessarily it's the marketization of stuff. We need to reinvent our idea of what the market is. And the market, back right to the phrase I mentioned, the market must serve the public interest. It must serve the public interest. The public interest is not the stock market. The public interest has got to be defined as something much wider and richer and more valuable than the stock market. Unfortunately, the stock market has dominated nearly all major decision-making since the end of the Second World War.
Yeah, and the stock market has a lot of strange whims and quirks to it. Sometimes I wonder if AI is a way for people working in tech to further remove themselves from responsibility.
It is, without any doubt at all. I mean, you can actually say it's not my decision. The computer said yes, or the computer said buy, or the computer said sell.
Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, it's funny. We were talking about the film Ex Machina earlier, and I sometimes think that AI as a sort of focus attracts a kind of religious worship to it as the height of technology, this vision of a singularity, for instance. I mean, what does it say? It's ostensibly it's off in the future. I think Ray Kurzweil predicted it for like 10 years from now, didn't he? But what does it say about us that we would entertain that as a vision of the future?
Because AI can do things we can't, we are genuinely in awe of it. And it really can do it. It's no question. It can do all sorts of extraordinary things. But are we going to be its master and decide the role we want it to play in our lives, or are we going to start, as it were, dancing to its tune? And this is a very real. This is not science fiction. I mean, that's why I love the way you talk and write. It's not science fiction. This is real. We've got to make decisions of who runs our lives, on what basis do we run them, and we're back to personal responsibility. Are we going to sustain personal responsibility, or are we going to, because it's convenient or because it looks real clever, hand it over to AI? I couldn't have done the report we're referring to here unless I'd done that prep year, quite by accident, on what AI was and understanding the power, the potential, and the dangers of AI.
This brings to mind two things. One is in Shoshana Zuboff's book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. She writes a lot about this idea of the inevitabilism of tech, that it's even just by its very nature, but also all the messaging around it, it's engineered to convince you that it is inevitable. And then there's another writer I like, Eugenia Morozov, who writes about techno-solutionism. And I saw about a year ago, he was writing about it in relation to COVID and all the track and trace apps, and that basically in our moment of desperation, we all sort of turned to technology, and the governments stood up and said, don't worry, we'll save you. We have track and trace. What did you make of that over the last year? I mean, it was messy.
I think it was, certainly in the UK, it was a shambles.
Yeah.
It's theoretically, it's not a bad idea, and certainly as a stopgap. But in the UK, it was a shambles, an embarrassing shambles, and a very, very expensive, embarrassing shambles. Yeah. So maybe what it did was prove the limits of something we were beginning to place our faith in.
Yes, yeah. I felt like it gave fuel to every conspiracy theorist while also revealing whoever it is that's about to engineer this malign takeover to be completely inept. But then, I am also actually, this leads on to your attitude towards state surveillance, because like Edward Snowden, for instance, famously said that GCHQ is much worse than the NSA.
I got two answers. One is, I think he may be onto something. I'm very lucky in that I know a lot of civil servants in the UK. And broadly speaking, the ones I know who are very senior in that area are utterly decent people. So when I go to sleep at night, there's two people, perhaps there's one woman in particular who's remarkable. And I think, what, she's going to make the final decisions about where this does or doesn't go. I'm safe. Now, whether that generation will continue to be in power, whether that generation will be continue to get the responsibility, I have no idea. But the people I personally know are good, decent people. I wouldn't say that are their political masters, but they themselves are very good, decent people. And that That allows me to sleep at night.
That's good to know. To bring it back to, I guess, big tech and this issue of monopolies, a lot of changes going on right now. Actually, like Tim Wu mentioned earlier, is on the Biden administration, and he's taking all these antitrust lawsuits. Do you see change happening, or is it going to actually do anything?
I don't know. I mean, what I do know is, and people wiser than me understand this better than I do, that once you start looking to the courts to sort out huge areas of complexity, you are gambling a little. I mean, I remember leaping in front of the television set when the Supreme Court in the UK defied Johnson over the business of when he could recall Parliament or couldn't. And I think that woman, Brenda Hale, was a remarkable woman, a really remarkable woman. Whether we're going to, in the UK or here in Ireland, continue to have Lord Chief Justices and Supreme Courts who take an ethical and absolutely moral position, you've got to hope so. But if ever the courts start to allow themselves to be undermined by what's often thought of as political expedience or political reality, then we're in every kind of trouble. At the moment, I think Ireland's well served. I think Europe generally is well served. Other parts of the world less so.
I think we talked a little about this earlier, but in relation to Estonia, but in Britain, for instance, or in Ireland, how would you see education keeping up with technological change? It's interesting. I was talking to Suzanne O'Sullivan and Luke O'Neill before this about COVID conspiracy theories, and they sort of brought it back to critical thinking, which goes far beyond technology.
They are right. We've got an interesting thing whereby, as you know, technically at the moment, you're an adult online or you're responsible online from 12 or 13. It varies slightly from country to country, but 12 or 13. I would argue that the situation is we've now reached with, from the age of 8, digital literacy, digital understanding, the differentiation between truth and falsehood should be taught from the age of 8. I think we've got to put it right forward, because I think by the time you start secondary school, it's almost too late. You'd be far more, your view is much more sophisticated than me. But I think these views and the use of social media are pretty well settled by the time you're 11 or 12.
Yeah.
At 7 and 8, you could still get young people to understand their responsibilities and their relationship with social media. But you've got to start there. And I don't know, interesting, I should know this about this. I think Estonia starts at around 10. But we've got to understand that our young people have got to have a full understanding of what is being potentially done to them far earlier than we've ever previously imagined. It's
so hard to even make sense of, because, for instance, I see it every time there's some scandal in Ireland around often students, young girls, their pictures being stolen and, so-called revenge porn, and it's now been relabeled as image-based sexual abuse. And that always brings it out of the woodwork, where people are ready to blame someone for having had an online life, basically, and existed in, to me, it just looks like existing in modernity. But yeah, where do you draw those lines, I suppose, around responsibility, how much education is enough? Because sometimes I think, the boys who have stolen those pictures are also really young and stupid. But what they're doing, I wonder, do they even understand the magnitude of what they're doing? Because it's going to destroy someone's life later. I'm not trying to say we should, be kind to them about doing this horrible thing. It's more just, and new versions of that are going to continue to appear into the future. New platforms, new ways to invade other people's privacy. And the brain is still developing at that age. You
slightly aren't, in a way, you're answering your own question, because the issue here is how equipped are we going to allow our teachers to be? This is a very, very sophisticated form of professional development. So we're going to need a generation of teachers who every 3, 4, 5 years are prepared to go back in and relearn or up their game in terms of the kind of pressures their own students are under. Now, this is a very long, I don't think, I won't do this to you. This is an enormously long conversation, but it really does come down to the willingness of the teaching profession to accept the fact that they are a learning profession. And the process of teaching has got to be a constant process of learning and relearning and learning again and learning. And the issue is, are the teaching unions, are teachers themselves really up for that? I love to think they will be. At the moment, I kind of doubt it. it was seen as a very, very abnormal expectation for someone entering teaching to feel they've got to, as it were, re-look at their teaching practice every 3, 4, 5 years.
Yeah, and who can even predict where it's going to go next?
Yeah.
I've been very pessimistic, as some audience members may agree, about technology, but I'd love to know where you see the sort of redeeming features of the online world right now, because there are some pretty wonderful things too.
I thought the last few pages of your own book were so hugely encouraging because
Oh,
because you've been on this journey, much more complicated journey than I have, and but you end up hoping for the best, and I think that's all we can do. But no point hoping for best if governments continue to be frightened of the social media companies, frightened of, in the same way that generations of governments were frightened of the big petroleum companies. You can't have that. There's got to be a reassertion of what government is, governance is, responsibility is, and we just got to take a good long look at ourselves and realise that unless we solve these problems, we're walking into a vale of tears, and it doesn't have. But you're saying in your book, you're right. It doesn't have to be that way.
And I always wonder if there's a life cycle, and if we were to study history, to look at, say, oil companies, there must be that initial phase of elation and curiosity and excitement. And we've seen that in the last, I would say the last maybe 20 years and 10 or so. Like it really peaked. There was this kind of global celebration of figures like Mark Zuckerberg, even though no one really aspired to be Mark Zuckerberg. But we were seeing him on the cover of every magazine. We had the film The Social Network. And then we have this decline and skepticism. What tends to be, I mean, how much longer do you reckon it'll be before it just sort of tips over?
I think there's some truth in what I said a little earlier, which is, as you go to bed at night, I think it's possible that Mark Zuckerberg is saying, when on earth will national governments wake up and realise they've got to bail me out by regulating me? They've got to do it because I can't do it, because every time I speak to my shareholders, they just shout me down. And when will they do it? And I can actually get on with my life and find some form of legitimacy, which is concordant with the original vision I had for this company. And I really believe that. No one I've talked to who knows him thinks Zuckerberg's a bad man. He's trapped. He's a trapped man. Just as I think the guys at Google, who are not bad people at all, or in Jack Dorsey, they're not bad people. They're trapped people, and they're trapped in the cycle of their share price.
It sounds like material for a play or possibly a film. Mark Zuckerberg's midlife crisis.
Yes.
It has to happen when he hangs up the hoodie and he never takes it down again. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'd love to open it up to everyone here to ask questions. This is a big nebulous one, but where do you think, what is the nature of truth in the online world? Is it consensus? Is it purely solipsistic thing? Is it eventually to be found on the internet, or should we all just go to libraries?
It's evidence. It's evidence-based. And it's having a generation that's sufficiently sophisticated to understand and dissect evidence and come to their own conclusions. But it has to be evidence-based. We've got to escape from. That's why we said right at the beginning, anyone who thinks that what we're making here, or what I'm doing, is assertions, please challenge me. Because by challenging me, you're forcing me back to find an evidence base for my arguments. So you're doing me a huge favour. It's evidence.
I like that. That's very optimistic too. Let's take some questions.
Just wondering, what's your vision of the future? Given the size and the truly global nature, as you say, the arrogance even of them with Gordon Brown, what's your vision of the future in a bad scenario? Like, how bad could things get? Is it too late to shut the stable door kind of thing? And the other quick thing was just to say, looking at people like Ridley Scott and Clint Eastwood, is there any chance we can pull you back more into film rather than doing the great job you're doing? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd answer the second one's the easy bit. I talk to Ridley a lot. He's really a good friend. The chance of me going back to the film industry is hell will freeze over. I really love my life, and the filmmaking potential in Skibbereen is limited. So I think that's a nice easy one. But where are we going? I think we've got to start. It sounds ridiculous. We've got to believe in ourselves a little more and believe in our capacity to create change. It's our lack of self-belief that's causing a lot of this. We're kind of looking to other people for answers. We're hoping that answers will emerge from technology. But in fact, the answers urgent answers have to emerge from us and our determination to reorientate ourselves to things that we value.
David, to return to what you said about the thorny question of anonymity and the kind of cost-benefit analysis of that. So I'm a recovering war reporter who now works on conflict prevention. And for mediators, the challenge posed by the weaponization of social media is enormous. So everybody knows about, the allegations of manipulation in the US, etc. Relatively few people, I think, are aware of how every conflict in the world now, you have a weaponization of social media. I've discussed this with people who helped negotiate the Good Friday Agreement here in Ireland, and they say, if social media had existed at the time of the Northern Ireland peace process, it would have been impossible, absolutely impossible. And going back to that question of anonymity, if you look at because they are troll and bot armies, these are armies, right? And I think the question of anonymity in terms of addressing that challenge, you mentioned whistleblowers and the need to protect whistleblowers. We've always had whistleblowers. We had whistleblowers before the internet. And there are other ways of whistleblowers obviously getting their information out. In the part of the world I work in the Middle East, the argument against anonymity is that you will basically take the opportunity of young activists, particularly those who were part of the so-called Arab Spring in 2011, the opportunity of them to organize and to militate, etc. But if we look at what's happening in Afghanistan right now, one thing I've struck by, and I reported on, the Taliban 1.0, looking at the Taliban now, they are on social media, they're recording themselves going into various homes, etc. And that the conflict aspect of this, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, because just quickly before I finish, I remember a couple of years ago hearing the CEO of Microsoft talk about cyber warfare. So whether we're talking about disinformation on a state level or a granular level. And he was talking about the need for what he described as a Geneva Convention for the information age we live in today. We know the Geneva Convention has been violated all the time, but it gives us a model to aspire to. So I wonder what you think of that. Should we be pushing for thinking about a Geneva Convention for the digital age? Thank you.
No, it's great. So a colleague of mine in the Lords, Martha Lane Fox, has been arguing for a digital convention in exactly the terms you're describing for quite a long while. She was the founder of lastminute.com. Very smart woman. A very good friend of mine is Jonathan Powell, who was central to the Good Friday Agreement, I think more than people realise. Now, Jonathan works in the world of mediation all over the world. And Jonathan, were he here right now, would say that secrecy is fundamental and anonymity is fundamental to bringing together warring factions in Colombia or wherever it may be. So I think there are all sorts of interesting areas here. I think if I look back at my life, I've spent a huge amount of it arguing against the notion of either or. People somehow want to embrace that it's going to be either this or it's that. And life's much more complicated than that. Everything is infinitely more complicated than that. So the notion, and I think this is what you're hinting at, the notion that we are so stupid that we can't differentiate between the anonymity that a whistleblower requires or the anonymity that someone negotiating peace between warring factions requires, and the anonymity that someone who merely wishes to blacken your name, my name, or that somehow there is an equivalence, is sort of nonsense, really. So the key really is to grow up enough to be able to say, you know what, that we will require, that, you're not going to do that anymore. That's just, you can't do that. Now, in the UK, we've got race relations laws, for example. So there are lines that you could, got to be quite careful, happily, to cross. No one argues that we shouldn't have race relations laws. Then why shouldn't we extend, for example, the slander laws? I can't think of a good reason. And that needn't invade the need for anonymity with whistleblowers or anonymity with peacekeeping missions. That's probably as good as I can come up with, honestly, as an answer.
When Zuckerberg was in front of Congress, he admitted he was a publisher. So why are big tech companies not treated as publishers? subject to normal taxation and libel laws, and
There is no possible reason. I mean, it was a mistake made in 1992 that hasn't been corrected, and it hasn't suited any national government to take them on and say enough's enough. I know, in a sense, that's central to my arguments. Is we're way past that now. We've got to get real, and that's why. I think regulation is beyond necessary. It should have been done a long while ago. And secondly, I actually think the regulation, and I really believe this, intelligent regulation, quite fierce regulation, is in the interests of the social media companies themselves. Because, we talked about, for example, personal responsibility. If they're not prepared to have people in senior positions who are prepared to take responsibility, not for errors, but for decisions, there's a difference, very big difference, then they're hiring the wrong people. So I think, in a sense, it's quite ironic. I think we're pushing an open door here. It's just that someone's just got to push it down and get on with it. We're just dancing around the parameters of an argument, of a fierce issue, which has huge ramifications to all of our lives. This is not a small issue. It affects every single one of us, every single day in different ways.
What I'm struggling with for the last 20 years is people coming into public space, telling lies, and we don't call them out on this. And we now say that there always has to be two sides of the story, but there is no other side to the story of a neo-Nazi. He shouldn't be in a public space, or she. So I'm struggling how to deal with this. Is censorship the way? Should we take voice out of people who are telling lies in public space? And just one comment on personal responsibility. Facebook may ask you, where did you spend the night? But you don't have to answer. This is on us, that we gave them so much power.
Yep.
Telling them our birthdays, telling them what's the name of our first pet and stuff like this. Because when I was IT journalist, every security conference that I went to, it's not on the hacker, it's on you. You did that to yourself. You put your personal information out, and they just used that. They didn't force your hand to do this. Thank you.
Well, you're right. We should be able to call out lies. And I mentioned to you that, for example, the House of Lords were not allowed to use the word. It's literally, you get chucked out of the chamber if you accuse someone of lying. You can tell them they are being the manner in which they're telling the truth is questionable, but you can't say they're lying. So it's a tough word. I'd say several things. The word censorship also needs some redefinition. What is censorship? I think fundamental to a lot of the arguments that you've heard here this afternoon is the following. There's been 2 or 3 very good books recently about the rise of fascism. Now, by God's good grace, in 1971, I made 2 movies on the documentaries, one about Germany 1918 to 1933 and one Germany 33 to 45. And they were, for me, it was fantastic. It was a masterclass in the rise of fascism and the complicity of individuals in the rise of fascism. The thing that most disturbs me is that almost everything Roisin and I have been discussing here only serves a rise of fascism. It does not serve the rise of democracy and debate. And that's the danger. We've kind of got a one-trick pony here, which will serve the means of fascism, but doesn't serve the means of democratic debate. And that's troubling, beyond troubling.
So in short, my question is, I'm wondering, how might the state facilitate people to change to improve the situation? Because we've discussed today that we've identified that the legal system needs to change to regulate the tech companies, and also the education system perhaps needs to change to create media literacy, digital literacy, and data literacy, I would argue, because I happen to work in change management, enabling digital transformation, so helping people learn the skills they need to enable digital transformation to happen in a company. And I find that people are exhausted with the rate of change that we face as a society. And I wonder, how are people in the education profession or in the legal system supposed to create the change that's needed when they're just trying to, deal with the rat race and get through the day-to-day and make enough to afford housing and healthcare and everything that people are currently struggling with in late stage capitalism?
Well, let me focus on what's one group, teachers. I've spent the last chunk of my life, in fact, the last third of my life really, working with teachers and for teachers. I love teachers, I really do. And I understand better than most the pressures they're under and what the role they take on in life is. So I've got nothing but sympathy. At the same time, I also know that they are our only answer. Unless we get the teaching profession right, unless we resource the teaching profession properly, unless we actually create the right goals for teachers and make their lives easier, but frankly more significant than they are. This isn't just a question of teachers taking people through to pass some exams at second level. It's far more profound than that. So I would say the group we've got to look at is our teachers, our teaching profession, and they've got to be equipped and inspired to drag us through the remains of the 21st century. That would be one thought. You're right, there is a sort of exhaustion, I think, that's set in, which is quite troubling. The very first part of your question, I'm sorry, I leapt onto teachers too quickly. We happen to have in Ireland a really, actually, I think, very remarkable woman who's got the worst job in the world, Helen Dixon, who's the Information Commissioner. She's really, really good. If you got Helen on her own here, and I have no idea what she would say, and asked her what her relationship with the Finance Department of Finance is in terms of taxation of global companies, if you asked her what the relationship with the general word of publishers is, she, I think, could give you some very, very clear, succinct answers. She's got a complicated job because she's tied into the what's going on in Europe with Mrs. Vestager and everything else. Those women, I really believe this, those women given a clear run at the right legislation, for the right reasons, imposed in the right way, would come up with answers. They're not allowed to. Because the sheer complexity of their roles gets distorted by the dance that goes on between, say, Department of Finance and the way in which corporations are and aren't taxed. So we're engaged in the wrong dance. There are people that have the answers, and most of those people are very, very good indeed, but they're not being given a clear run in providing those answers. That's a kind of coded message to you on which to finish.
I'd just like to thank Lord David Puttnam, and also thank you all for attending.
Thank you very much.